Haidete o Filoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, The Manifesto, for more info. In this episode, I'm talking with Adrian Hunhausen about his journey into learning Koine Greek, his new lexicon, which he has published through Argos Didaski, which is Jenny Teichmann's website. It's also available on Amazon here in the US, and I believe in some other countries as well. And we also discuss a surprising discovery he made during that process of learning and working on this lexicon. So get your earbuds ready and tune in. This is another great interview and some really great content to help you in your journey of learning ancient and Koine Greek. Well, hi, Adrian. It's really great to have you on the podcast. I know you've kind of been making the rounds talking about your dictionary, but thanks for stopping in here too.
Hey, listen, you're more than welcome, and stop calling it a dictionary because it's a lexicon.
Lexicon, okay, there
Dictionary
we
would
go.
be something totally different. But I
Or as
really
you,
appreciate the opportunity to talk about it here, and I look forward to some tough questioning.
well,
And as we would say in Greek, "Arxaito he anakrisis." Let the interrogation begin.
I'm probably not the most how do you say sharp interrogator, as the case may be, but I just, again, I like this format because it lets me interview people and help other learners find out what's out there. So
Let's do
I
it.
think that's a primary value. So the big thing I like to ask people is, how did you get into Greek? So what's your story? I watched part of your interview with Jenny Teichmann, and so I know you're quite the accomplished polyglot. So what came first? What got you into languages, and then how did you learn Greek?
Um, my interest was in history when I was younger, and so I actually studied medieval history at university. And I was told that I would need to learn at least Latin and that I should do Greek, but I was too scared to do the Greek. So I did Latin at university and didn't learn it very well because it was grammar translation method, and um, I'm not one of those um, gifted people that can learn a language that way.
Hmm.
So it didn't really, none of the Latin, not much of the Latin really stuck with me. And it didn't occur to me to do the Greek until many years later. And then I started, wow, it must have been, well, nearly 25 years ago. I think I was on a trip in Jerusalem, and just in the bookshop, I picked up a book for learning New Testament Greek and went from there. And then I guess I finished the book, and I guess I fooled myself, like, and I'm probably not unique in doing this, into thinking that I could read Greek, whereas I think actually what I was doing is I had gotten familiar enough with Greek to recognize in Greek Bible verses that I already knew from English or from whatever other language. And I don't think I don't think I'm the only one to whom that has ever happened. And then you know what I'm talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, they tell you when you're learning, it's nice to read. If you can read something that you already know in one language, it helps you because you can focus on the Greek, but like focus on the target language you're trying to learn. But then at the same time, like when you then jump into reading something that you've never encountered before in the language, you realize quickly, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I need a lot more support than I thought I did. So yeah, I definitely think I've had that experience.
Yeah. And so I think I was trying, I picked up a copy of Aesop's Fables or something like that, which isn't
Yeah.
terribly complicated. And I realized I had no idea what I was doing, and that my what I thought was my training in New Testament Greek really hadn't been that effective. And so at that point, I realized I needed to take a different tack. And I think I ran across Polis method, at least the textbook, just by
Mm.
accident, whether it came up on my stream of recommendations on Amazon or something like that. So I picked up that textbook, and that was a revelation because it treated ancient Greek or Koine Greek as if it were any other language that you would have to use it actively in order to get good at using it passively. So you have to speak it and write it in order to be able to read it, which I think that's my experience with other languages.
Yeah.
So I did that textbook, then realized that they offered courses. And so I went and did their intensive 3-week course in Rome one summer
Mm.
and learned a lot there, made a lot of progress there, and met a couple of other people that were just as enthusiastic about it as I was. And so we've been working together sort of since then.
Okay.
So
So, I mean, that's a story I've heard a lot of times
yeah.
from people in the podcast is started out with a book or, university or seminary course and using grammar translation and then found comprehensible input kind of methods, communicative input methods later.
Yeah, definitely. And it was, and my background is really in modern languages. I mean, I did my university degree in medieval history, but I work as a linguist now. And so I'm really familiar with learning languages. And it made complete and total sense to
Yeah.
treat ancient Greek the same way as I've treated my other modern languages or my other languages, which are all modern. So,
Yeah.
and I mean, I guess my real interest, the thing that I'm most enthusiastic about reading is, I want to say history, late, kind of, history of late antiquity, most of which is in Greek, whether that be, I don't know, Eusebius or Zosimos or whatever that, but also the antique novels
Mm. Yeah.
is, and I'll read the Acts of whatever apostle, those kind of things as well, saints' lives. So that's the kind of thing that I enjoy reading the most. I really have little, I shouldn't admit this too loud, but I don't really have a lot of interest in the classical Greek, the Athenian Greek, like um, the Greek, the Athenian orators or Thucydides or Plato or Xenophon. I really find, I, to be honest with you, I don't find that stuff interesting in the slightest.
Huh.
So the things that I like to read are much more in Koine than in Attic Greek.
That's interesting. That may sort of put you in a unique, again, another unique group within the people I've interviewed. I mean, majority of people are either biblical Greek or, specifically like Septuagint, New Testament, or,
Yeah,
maybe more Attic,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Attic
yeah.
focus. So that's interesting.
Right. And I always say that to me, the like a lot of the Athenian oratory is about court cases in Athens, like
Yeah.
legal disputes in Athens. And that reminds me, I mean, and I have Gorky is on my lap. As you can probably see my black cat. Gorky is on my lap, and I love cats to death. But reading about cats fighting in a sack is just not my idea of fun.
Yeah.
And that's to me is like Athenian litigation is cats fighting in a bag. And then when Greek city-states go to war against each other, it's just cats fighting in a bag on a greater scale. And they're always offending each other's honor and and trying to take revenge on this slight to their honor or whatever. They're always changing sides. And then, yeah, again, so it's just kind of like really nasty courtroom litigation on a bigger scale. So reading Thucydides or Xenophon, it's not really my thing either. So
Yeah. Well, and I think I imagine there's quite a lot of, there's probably a lot more Greek in Koine, I would
yeah.
think, than there is
Oh, and
Attic.
again,
Um,
a lot of people don't even know that it exists. There's so much good stuff to read in Queen, and most people are not even aware that it exists. So
so like you mentioned the novels. I mean, I've heard of a few, right? I've Daphne and Chloe, I know of that one.
yeah.
I think there's what's the one that's set in Ephesus, I think.
Now that one is not bad. That's Xenophon Ephesos was the author, and it's
That's
given
right.
various names. The one that I would have to say is my favorite is by a guy named Chariton. and it's Kali Roe is what it's normally
Yeah.
entitled. It is fantastic. It is really stunning. And like I told Luke when I was speaking with him about it, it reminds me of Alexandre Dumas, who wrote, the Three Musketeers and the
Yeah.
Count of Monte Cristo, and like that kind of really nice prose. So that's my favorite, and I'm really, really looking forward to reading the Aethiopika by Heliodorus. And that is apparently a little bit more difficult to read because the vocabulary is a little more difficult. So I'm thinking that's going to be my book for 2025.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, there's five of them, and I would say I've read three in their entirety. One of them is just absolutely fantastic, and I've read three and a half, and I'm thinking the fifth one by Heliodorus is my project for 2025, and I'll let you know how that goes.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I think I talked about it maybe with Jenny about novels or
Yeah.
something, but I've read, struggled through like I think 3 books of Daphne and Chloe just because I guess it was
Yeah,
I heard of.
that's more particular. That's more particular. It's not my personal favorite. I can see Goethe apparently that said that was, he read that one every year. It was so
Huh.
fantastic that he reread Daphne and Chloe every year. I don't get that, but Charito, try that one. It's
I'll have to.
easier and it's definitely more fun.
Okay, well if it's easier, that's good because
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
like
yeah.
I feel like with Greek, the main problem is vocabulary, right? There's just again the corpus is so big, um, and I think like you and Jenny talked about, like you have to pick a dialect. I mean that helps, but like if you're, the corpus is so big that if you're used to the like biblical words, you kind of learn that. Then you jump to, something else. You get all this day-to-day
Yeah.
life stuff and all this
And you
vocab.
got to be careful. I think if your preparation is in biblical Greek, then you've set yourself up for a big shock when you want to expand. And this novel by Hariton, it is in like Koine. It's the kind of Koine that could have been written by Luke.
Mm,
It's not if you can hard to measure whether we can really read Luke fluently because we know the stories so well.
yeah, that's
But
true.
but Chariton is in something like that style. The sentences are about that long. The extent of the vocabulary is about like that. So that would make a nice bridge for people who are pretty confident in biblical Greek.
One of these, I'm sure it's been lemmatized and all that stuff somewhere. Maybe it's probably in Perseus, I would think, like the Skyphia viewer.
I don't know. I know that Bryn Mawr has issued a commentary on the first book of it, but that's only the first book of I can't remember how many. But it's not bad. I'm sure it's bad. I think there's a Loeb edition of it that I'm not a big fan of mirror editions, the
Yeah,
original text on one side and a translation on the other. I'm not a big fan of those, but it is available in several languages in a mirror edition. But it's not terrifying.
yeah, I kind of agree with you actually. I found um the mirror translation is useful if and only if if as a learner, I think it's useful if and only if the translation of it is literal enough and obvious enough, and they haven't reordered a whole bunch of stuff. Because if you could spend all this time, I'm trying to figure out this like one phrase, but it's been moved around so much in the English translation because of necessity that I no longer, it's not worth the effort. Um,
And I think that they've started to do this in Latin. They've started to issue editions where the explanations are also in Latin. And
ah,
we need more of this in Greek where uh, the instead of getting a translation of the Greek text, we get a simplification in easier Greek or
yeah,
an explanation of the more difficult vocabulary, but also in Greek, so we can stay
yep,
in that mental space, and that will enable us to improve so much faster than mirror editions. So,
agreed.
and I've
Um,
got some on the way, don't you worry.
okay, well, cool. We'll have to have you back to talk about those once you get a couple of them published. Um,
Yeah, the first one is going to be the ghost stories.
oh, that's right. You told me about that when we were
Yeah, and you can hope
setting
to
up the
get
interview.
it. make it available before Halloween 2024, but we'll see.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And it's interesting. Like, Roos is a Greek boy at home has some of that.
Yeah,
Not like the lexicon he gives, in the back has some words in Greek defined in Greek.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, that would be another cool project would be for someone out here is to take that as a starting point and keep authoring definitions, for words in Greek.
Yeah, yeah, that would be nice. And listen, I'm cheating because not cheating. I have the advantage that I've done my lexicon. And so at least the corpus information is already there for me. I've already got an entry for nearly every word that I need.
Yeah.
And so I just copy and paste it into what I'm preparing. And then I do have to convert the definition to Greek, but it's usually not too bad. So the lexicon is giving me a leg up on preparing these upcoming editions as well.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of the lexicon, Opharos, what when in your process, like when in your journey of learning Greek, did you decide, hey, what I really need is a thematic guide to vocabulary, so I know how all these words relate and work? Like when did that idea start becoming reality?
During my first intensive 3-week course in Rome,
Okay,
where we
so pretty early
were,
then.
yeah, and we were speaking Greek all day. Okay, I'm not gonna lie. Well, the first week we didn't. The first week where we were all in shock. And then towards the end of the second week of the three, a couple of us started speaking spontaneously in Greek with each other. And when you start doing that, all of a sudden you need words. You need to know, well, how do I say
Yes.
this? And when I've learned other languages, I've always had learning aids where the vocabulary was organized by topic. And these are easy to find for Spanish or French or Italian or German. And I'm assuming you can find them for Chinese or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, there must be something like this for Greek. And I got home and um, no, there wasn't. Whatever seemed to be something working in that direction was totally inadequate. So um, there is somebody did a Greek version of Comenius. Are you familiar with Comenius?
I'm not, sorry.
So this was a 17th century, well, I guess late 16th and first half of the 17th century Czech Protestant scholar who was exiled from Bohemia at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. But he was an educator. And at that time, anybody who had, I mean, school was in Latin
Yeah.
for most people. And so he made teaching materials for helping people to learn Latin. And the most famous one is called Orbis Pictus, where he's got a picture, for example, there'll be a picture of I don't know, of a bakery. And then he, puts a couple paragraphs together telling you what happens at a bakery with all the Latin words
Hmm.
that you would need to talk about that. And he's got, I don't know how many, 60 categories or whatever in there. And then there's a much expanded one, I think, which is called Janua Reserata or something like that. But anyway, somebody did a Greek version of his one that was originally in Latin quite early on, and that has been republished recently, but it's horrible because the words are from different dialects, and the poor people who assembled it, they were
Yeah.
just happy to find a word that meant the same thing as the Latin word that they already knew, and they had no means of determining how common it was.
Right.
So you'll find a word from Homer in there, you'll find, words from Aeschylus or whatever that will not occur in prose, but these poor people, they didn't have our corpus tools, and so that they did the best they could. And any of the books that I found, and this is 6 years ago now, were all inadequate basically in that same way. They never told you how common the word was, and so you never knew whether it was worth you learning it. And that's horrible. Like you don't want to waste your time. Like I don't really I mean, I can't read every book that has survived in ancient Greek.
Right.
And so if a word survives in some, piece of epic poetry written in the style of Homer, like, I don't know, Apollonios or Rhodios or something like that, if it's only in there, well, I don't want to learn that because I'm probably never going to read that. And so I was super frustrated. And I was like, well, oh, I need to see words and that were frequent. I want to learn those. I don't want to learn the words that occurred a couple times in epic poetry or whatever. And there was just nothing out there for it. So I basically had decided, okay, I better do this myself.
That makes sense. Um, I feel like that's one of those places for digital tools, really. Like we could, the data's there and we're getting more and more things lemmatized and marked up. And, we know what's prose and we know what's poetry. So hopefully in the near future, we could actually have, some kind of online tools where you can log in and say, I want to know, how do I say this? Like, I want some information about this word.
Yeah,
Is it prose?
and
Is it poetry? Is it common? Is it not? And that'd be a simple click and, type it and click and you're done.
we're not far from that now, but you have to subscribe to this website that I was telling you about, which
Yeah.
is Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. I hate the way the stuff in Greek has Latin names, as if like that needs to change. It's like we're not in the 18th century anymore. There's people who
Yes.
want to do Greek who don't have Latin, and to force them to like I'm going to be totally honest with you. I still, to this day, like some of the works that I've quoted from in my lexicon, well, the titles are in Latin. I have no idea what those books are called
Yeah.
because my Latin isn't good enough to know what the title of the book is in Latin. And you want to talk about gatekeeping? How about restricting the access to one dead language to only the people who have total mastery of another dead
Mhm.
language? So
Yeah.
that really annoys me, but the site is fantastic. So you put a word in and you can do a full search through the entire Greek corpus if you want and see exactly what kind of works, what authors it appears in, and you can construct your own subsets. And
Mhm.
so that's what I ended up doing. I think I started with a subset of maybe 8 Queen authors, obviously including Old Testament, New Testament, and then, maybe Josephus, Plutarch. I think I had 8 to start with, but then I started reading a few more things in Quine. I'm like, I would like to include these guys. So it eventually grew to the 22 Koine sources that are in the lexicon as it stands now.
And one of the features I think is really neat here in your lexicon, besides the fact that it's easy to follow the ordering and stuff, but like the way you use font size and like bolding to indicate what's common. So like I can open up to any given section. Like I just randomly opened it up to 17 on horseback riding, and it says like to drive or ride, and I can look at this and know that my two most common terms are elavnin and Apelavnin. And that's just, I didn't have to read anything. I just looked at the list immediately and knew, okay, this is probably what I want to say. And then you've got definitions and example sentences and, extra information as well. Um, but it's just cool that it's got all this information focused on how do you say stuff rather than in addition to what does it mean? Like what would be the common way to say it? So I mean, that's really, really user friendly.
I hoped to make it that way, and I don't know of anybody else who has used these. I guess I can call them tricks before, but I tried to. Well, I mean, when I started this project, I really wasn't that good. I'm a lot better now, 6 years later, than when I started the project. But the whole time, I tried to keep in mind, okay, what would be useful to somebody that is in that position that I was when I started?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so but the kind of things that I wish I could, the kind of information I wished I had access to right away when I was at that stage, well, I've tried to make the lexicon in such a way that that information is available to everybody. So how common the word is, which authors, used it is immediately visible. The way words are derived from each other is instantly visible. So I'm proud of the way I organize the information.
And another cool feature here too is you also provide I'll say cultural info or background information about the words in some cases. So like you have a whole thing on like again just open it to another page names of months. There's an explanation and then there's like the various classification systems in there. And like so it's not just a lexicon in that sense.
I
You're
didn't want to scare people by calling it an encyclopedical lexicon, but there's that element in, and I'm gonna tell you, I have to admit, I learned an awful lot just by having to organize this vocabulary. And the one that traumatized me the most was learning how you like when you once you harvest grain, what do you have to do to it? And there's all of these steps, whether you thresh it, you hull it, you mill it, all of that
Yeah.
stuff. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not a farmer or a bread maker, so I don't know that stuff. Like, there must be people in the modern world that know this stuff, but I didn't. And I had to go basically, I couldn't just put the words down because they would make no sense that way. So I actually had to go learn how they processed grain, like how they processed wheat, how they processed barley. And of course, the fact that so many more people were involved in that because
Yeah.
most people were involved in agriculture. So the words for those processes are really common in ancient Greek texts, whereas we never use a word like, I guess, to whole grain. I don't think I've ever used that in conversation in my life.
Yeah.
But the word for whole, like the word for whole grain is pretty frequent in ancient Greek texts. And so I had to go and kind of learn a lot of that stuff. And it's in the lexicon. And so it has that kind of character of a kind of a brief encyclopedia as well, where it will explain how all these, I mean, fulling cloth,
Mm.
like how do you make cloth? Like I had no idea. And so I do now, and it's all in it's all in the lexicon. And there's a bunch of steps in the making of cloth that I didn't know existed. So
Well, and that's one of those things that you pick up when you learn, a modern language is like the language reflects the culture and the worldview of the people. So, like, I mean, I speak a Malay language. There's like three or four different words for rice because that's
yeah,
what I eat, and like the different states of rice, and then like if you cook it, and then the stuff left in the bottom of the rice cooker has its own term,
yeah,
and
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
so it's like you kind of you learn in learning a modern language, you learn the world in addition to the language itself. Whereas with Greek, like you don't have that interaction with speakers. You're not there in the world with it. So you may not catch that stuff unless you're really paying attention and really digging or have good tools like,
Yeah,
lexicon
I
for
hope
one.
I've provided something that is useful. And I cannot praise enough or I cannot emphasize the usefulness of using what I guess is a dead language actively. We have, I myself and the others that I speak with regularly, we have learned so much by just having to communicate about what we're doing in ancient Greek. And when you have to communicate everyday things, whatever they mean, whatever, if you force yourself to say whatever you want to say in that other language,
Yep.
it forces you to ask all kinds of questions
Yeah.
that you would never ask if you don't use the language actively. So if you're doing the traditional grammar translation method, whether it's Attic Greek or Biblical Greek or whatever, and even if you're doing, the writing where you're basically translating their sentences into Greek, the sentences that they have chosen for you to translate do not force you to ask the same questions
Right.
as you're forced to ask when you have to communicate your everyday life in
Right.
the language.
I mean, because if you want to say I had steak for dinner, that's not going to, you probably get eat somewhere in a first or second year language course, but the word, how would you specify steak versus some other kind of meat, and how would you say steak is usually grilled? Well, maybe that's relevant. So maybe you then have to say grilled beef or something like.
Right, right. So
You're right.
and that you can that's in here, the word for beef, is there, and then you would have to, instead of just saying have steak, you would have to say the beef prepared in that certain way, and so that's in there as well. And it wasn't easy for me to figure out how they did their cooking.
Hmm.
That's not obvious either, and
I've
so all of that is in there too.
and that's yeah, again, super super valuable. I think it's actually Luke Ranieri. I think he calls it the ephemeros or whatever everybody calls his method. It's in one of his videos.
And it
He
is,
talked about just like writing your write your journal, what you did today, write that out in Greek, read it, record it, listen to it. as a learning method. And even for those of us that can't find people to speak with regularly, I mean, even just doing things like where you're writing and then reading it out loud, you're still engaging those various output. And if you're listening to your, I mean, if you're speaking something, you're also kind of hearing it. So it's letting you engage multiple of those, strands of language learning. Um,
I think that he's absolutely right in recommending that. I think that anybody who hasn't seen his videos on that should go and look at them. You can probably put a link to that.
yeah, I'd have to find it, but he has a great one recently on shadowing. Um,
Yep. Yeah,
I've,
yeah, yeah, yeah. He's a very experienced language learner, but fortunately for us, he's not a language learner who has been trained to do that at universities. And so his methods are infinitely more practical
hmm,
than what you'll normally find used in universities, whether that be in North America or in Europe. So, and he and I are similar in that way that I mean, I have had no training in Greek at any university. I did do the intensive course in Rome for the Polis Institute twice, but other than that, it's me working on it either by myself or with these other people that I met
yeah,
on the course. And so that puts you in a completely different, it allows you to learn the language in a completely different way.
yeah. Well, and the great thing is now there are opportunities to study in that way. I mean, like you mentioned Seamus earlier when we were talking, like I did a Greek RPG with him as a
Yeah.
class. Like
Yeah.
I was, again, talking of things you have to think about how to say, like we were doing a Call of Cthulhu style thing set in modern, like in futuristic India. I mean, and I know he said that was really hard for him trying to run that, facilitate that game. I mean, not really hard, but like facilitating a role-playing game is difficult. Facilitating it in an ancient language is difficult, is even more
Right.
difficult. But those kinds
And
of things are
I,
out there.
yeah, and I agree with you, but I would want to add one caveat to that. Um, I do think it is reasonably important to keep in mind your end goal, which is to
Yes.
read ancient texts. And so I've never been a big fan of I don't I try not to waste much time looking for words for things that ancient people simply did not have. And so if I can find an easy way to say, electricity or whatever, I'll do that. But I try not to use neologisms. And we also, when we speak, we try, I guess, not to. Well, I don't know. Let me give you a stupid example. Jenny and I, when we were talking about how to format the lexicon, we did that in English. We didn't try to, struggle to find all the ancient words for, I don't know, indenting
Yeah.
and,
I mean,
and what.
typesetting wouldn't have even been a thing.
Right, because typesetting
How did
didn't
you
exist.
typeset? You wrote without spaces in lines that filled the paper. I mean, that was kind of
Right.
it.
Right. And so theoretically, you could lose a lot of time, and I'm too old to do this. You could lose a lot of time worrying about how to talk about modern stuff in ancient languages. And that's never, some people, I guess they must just find that fun in and of
Yeah.
itself. And that's not me. I mean, I love to talk in ancient Greek, but I don't particularly, I'm going to talk about stuff that's common to our lives and their lives rather than so um yeah, I don't need to talk too much about my kitchen appliances in ancient Greek. And they're not in the lexicon. There's no neologisms in there. Um and there's no word stolen from modern Greek in there either.
Hmm.
It's all Koine in my lexicon.
Well, that makes sense. And that's I've done some other classes with Seamus, where it's really centered around discussing the text. So like we're reading a Koine or ancient text and we're discussing it in the same language it's written in.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I like that. I wish I had more opportunities to do that with, friends or people because I feel like that's a really valuable method because you're trying to figure out, well, hey, this is a new word. Well, how can we explain what it means in Greek, you know?
yeah, or find a synonym or whatever,
Yeah.
which gives you the kind of the definition, but also reinforces your familiarity with the synonym, and that's what we need to be doing more of. But I think more people will be doing this kind of thing. I think it'll probably
Yeah.
be growing over the next, 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and I mean the modern SLA and research and stuff is definitely starting to trickle into how Greek and things are taught. I mean, like in the biblical languages world, I know Glossa House
Yeah,
is published a book or two, and they're constantly talking about these kinds of things, trying to promote the methods. And Jenny and Luke and other people I've had on here doing the same thing. So
yeah.
um,
And
and
I guess what else should I say about my lexicon? It's um again, it's corpus based. It's based on 22 Koine sources, biblical, also Philo of Alexandria and Josephus. So that's, for people who want to learn Greek for that purpose, it's there, but a lot of pagans in there as well. There's technical texts in there. I'm kind of proud of myself. I think I covered the, Koine Greek pretty thoroughly. There's all different kind of texts in there. So
well, and you've covered a wide variety of topics. And you have an index in the back, which is nice because you're saying, well, hey, how do I say you look at the list in the front and you say, well, okay, I, I'm looking for something and it's not I can't guess which one of the topics it goes under, and then you flip to the
yeah,
back
because
and
there's
say, oh, there it
38,
is.
yeah, 38 main chapters.
Yeah. And
And
it's not a small
often
book either. It's what, it's 2.5 inches
it's
thick by, a
uh,
foot.
it's 671 pages.
Yeah, so it's quite comprehensive.
Yeah, and I hope that it will be yeah, I hope it'll be useful for everybody. I've made a big effort to make it easy to use. And I think a lot of the kind of tricks that are in it that I've used here, I haven't seen anybody do them before. And I'm not sure anybody will ever do it again because, like I said, I've got, every word I checked which of those 22 sources it appeared in, but that is not nearly as easy. Listen, I don't know if that sounds easy or not. It was insanely time consuming because,
Oh, sure.
just to give you an example, a stupid example, the word for the kind of an archaic word for a spear is akon, but akon can also mean unwilling. So I get to this word akon and I got to tell,
Oh, yeah.
as spear, and I got to know which of these 22 sources uses it in that sense. Well, you pop that into your search engine. Well, it gives you not only all the instances of that word where it's the spear, but also all of the instances where it means unwilling. And your only way to sort that out is to basically read every entry and see from the context which one it means. And so it was insanely laborious and time consuming to do the corpus check for all 16,000 of the head words that are in the lexicon. And I'm not sure that if I had known how time consuming it would be, I'm not sure I would have actually even started the project. I don't need to do another one like this again in my life. And I'm not sure anybody else will ever be as masochistic
Yeah.
as to do something like this. I mean, theoretically, somebody could do something like this for Attic and Atticizing authors. I'm not sure anybody will or should do this because it was insanely time consuming. I think I'm
Well,
I'm happy with the result, but it was a lot of work.
it sounds like, I'm listening to that, and then it's with my background thinking about data and how that works together. It sounds like, again, these things could be easier if the data was marked up better. If someone had been able to tag that this lemma is actually spear, or the sense of this thing, this
And
is spear versus that. And hopefully we'll get that.
I don't know how close we are to that. Again, I'm not sure how good machine. I mean, you would be able to, I don't know, create a bank of military words and see if the word akon shows up in vicinity with other military words, but I'm not sure that would necessarily isolate it from the unwilling,
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of stuff a lot of work that I did that I don't think computers are going to be able to do anytime soon.
Yeah, no, and I don't think anyone's really investing the time to give us any AI models that are particularly well trained on ancient Greek. So uh,
Right. So
once we
for
get
now,
there, it
I
might be a
guess,
different story, but until
yeah.
then,
Yeah, and so for people who really love, really want Attic instead of Koine, it is good for them too, because I have one person in the group that really prefers the Attic stuff, and just um because of him, I actually did a secondary check for every single head word to see if it appeared in one of the six most famous Attic prose authors. So that information is already in there for every word. It doesn't tell you how many times each head word appeared in Attic texts, but if it appears in any of those six most famous prose authors, it's there. So it should be. Hopefully, it'll be useful for everybody, and nobody will have to go through what I went through again.
Well, and I found it like reading the New Testament, right? I've got tons of lexicons locked into stuff. I mean, there's a lot of resources for that. But what's often missing, I find, is that okay, what are the other words related to this term? Like the author chose this one, he didn't choose all these others. What does that web of words look like? So if I'm trying to parse out what is his shade of meaning here, I've your lexicon sits on my desk when I'm reading to say, okay, this is giving me the rest of that context that was in his head or that could have potentially been in his head that just looking it up and say LSJ or you know a New Testament lexicon doesn't.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think even for people who are just interested in reading and not interested in speaking, this is still a valuable resource because it's saying here's the rest of the semantic domain that the author chose not to pick, and here's the distinctions between these words that he could or
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And that is the next level of reading is, thinking about being at least aware of what choices the author could have made
yeah.
and then seeing what he or she did right. That's a reflection of when you're aware of what words he or she didn't choose, and chose this one instead, that tells you a lot more. And if you don't know those other words, you're missing half of the story.
Well, and like
So
we were saying a little bit earlier, I think before we started recording, like especially biblical narratives tend to be very sparse on detail. So when there's a detail, it's intentional usually and probably important. So it's nice to be able to know those things. But
yeah, and we should probably mention what we were talking about before as
I was going to say, I think we sort of set up that segue pretty well now. So when you were doing this research, you found something that was you thought was pretty surprising.
yeah, really surprising. And since we basically speak, myself and these others, we speak in ancient Greek, we have to, and we've met several times in the summer to basically spend the week together doing nothing but speaking and reading ancient Greek. And so you have to talk about practical things. And one thing that you had better learn to do is to make appointments and say, okay, we're going to meet at the cafe at whatever time. And so, you
Okay,
know,
so if I say, let's meet at six, at the sixth hour, then ekten oran.
yeah.
What have I
Yeah, well, what people used to
what have I
think is,
said?
well, okay, and that's the thing. What people used to, everybody has thought is that the Greeks said the time in the same way as the Romans. And a lot of people are pretty familiar with how the Romans gave the time, and they kind of did it the way we do. I mean, they started counting from sunrise, and so the first hour for them was what we would call 7 in the morning. Let's just pretend that we're at the equinox, just for the sake of simplicity.
So
But
so let me ask you a follow-up for that real quick. So if I'm an ancient Roman and
yeah,
and I want to say right after sunrise,
yeah.
that does that hour have a number or do I just say
No,
sunrise?
no, you would say in Latin, I can't, ortus soles or whatever,
Because
right? So
for
you,
us, I mean, we start it's 12 to 1, right? And so unless you're using a 24-hour clock, you don't
yeah, so
have
they
a
would have,
0 hour.
yeah, but they didn't complicate their lives. They had sundials, and so each line on their sundial was one of their hours,
So
right?
we're starting,
And
so Romans are starting from zero, essentially,
they're
and zero
starting
would
from
be
zero.
sunrise, and
Yeah.
I guess 12 would be sunset.
Well, midday, right? Midday would be 6,
Yep.
and sunset would be 12. And then you hardly ever find Latin text. I know this now. I didn't know this at the time, but they hardly ever actually say at the 12th hour because that's sunset. So they'll just say at sunset.
Okay. So
So the
for
12th is
Roman,
hardly ever mentioned because that's sunset anyway. They didn't call sunrise the 0 hour, but that's effectively what it was. And so all we have done is we've changed starting point. So when we started using in the Middle Ages, when we got mechanical clocks, and we started using 24 equal hours over the course of the day instead of the stretchy hours that the Romans had, which were longer in the summer and narrower in the winter. The logical thing to do was to count, to recalibrate and start the counting from the one fixed point, which is the same every day, and that was midday. So basically, in the 15th century, everybody started counting, saying that zero was going to be midday. So our 1 o'clock in the afternoon is 1 hour after midday. Whereas the Romans, they also had 12 hours during the day, but they were the stretchy ones, and they started from sunrise. So the 1 hour after sunrise, that would be the first hour.
Okay. So, all right. So that makes sense. So when we're speaking about
Yeah.
Roman hours, we're saying a complete, like the number of hours that have already elapsed.
Right. And so we basically do the same thing. We just start counting from a different point. And so we
Okay.
basically are using the Roman system, right? And everybody had always assumed that the Greeks did it, in the Greco-Roman world, like the Greeks did it the same way. And, it was my job to kind of organize the phrases having to do with hours. And I started, finding stuff that didn't really fit very well like that. And so one of the first ones I saw is actually the only mention of a numbered hour in the Old Testament, and it's in the third book of Maccabees, and it's the king, I think it was Mesuses Decates Horas, which is when in the middle of the 10th hour. And I'm like, wait a second, that really, really threw me off because we don't do that. Like, yeah, and the Romans didn't do that, right? So we'll say, I don't know, so that's in the afternoon. We'll say we start with 3 o'clock and we'll say, okay, at 3:30, right? We don't say halfway through 3 o'clock. It just
So
made it
is
just
that
made no sense. And this Greek text, and it's in the Old Testament, it was saying, halfway through the 10th hour. And I'm like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I started finding more of these texts where they're talking about at the beginning of the whatever hour, and then it was at the end of the whatever hour. And I'm like, this is, and I just sort of got confused. And I'm like, I want to see a sundial where the hours are labeled in an ancient Greek sundial with the hours labeled. And there are a few of them that survive. And when I found a picture of one, it just blew my mind because the hours are not labeled like we do on our modern clocks or an imitation Roman sundial. The numbers don't correspond to the lines, they correspond to the intervals between the lines.
okay? So what you're saying there is we'd have, if we're looking at a Greek sundial, we'd have the lines,
Yeah.
but we'd say the first line, which would be sunrise, and then what we would consider to be
Right.
one
And that's
o'clock.
just the border of the sundial. It's not
Right.
really a line.
So
But then
yeah, there's the border. That first line, instead of having like a one or alpha or whatever they're using, it's not on that line. It's sitting in
no,
between the border and that first line.
exactly. And so they were talking about the intervals, not the borders. They were talking about the intervals between the borders.
So if we'd say like ten proten oran, we mean after sunrise, but before the first seasonal hour, the first 60 minutes, just
And
for
yeah,
simplification, is over.
right. And so it puts you within a 1 hour long zone.
Interesting.
And so that once I understood that, and this is, and again, and I was finding texts where, I mean, this was really, really clear that this is what they were doing. And it became clear that they didn't even have the concept of one of those borderlines being a moment in time. They never talked about those borderlines. That just was not an abstraction that they ever made. They only talked about what was between those lines,
Hmm.
right? And so you've got stuff, and everybody will be familiar with some of these things from the Bible. I think it's in the Gospel of John, where the royal officials, the imperial officials, child gets, I guess, healed remotely by Jesus. He's not there yet,
Right.
right? And then when they get there, he's already healed, and they're like, "Well, what time did that happen?" Well, right, and so the Greek tells us ten hebdomen horan, and that's been always mistranslated at the seventh hour as if it were one of those lines. but it doesn't mean that. It means within that seventh zone on the sundial. So that simply puts you within that hour-long interval, but doesn't tell you anything more specific about whether it's the beginning of that interval, the middle, or the end. They had the linguistic means to say beginning, middle, or end, but sometimes they didn't feel the need to.
Oh yeah, I mean we do the same thing. So what time did that happen? Well, it's 1 o'clock, and we just kind of mean somewhere. But we usually when we say that, we kind of mean somewhere around
Yeah, we'll say one-ish.
one-ish, right?
Yeah, when did that? Yeah, one-ish, sure. And so they had that option that they could, and they could plunk it within one of those intervals. And they also had the means, and you'll find this very specific archomenes, tes hebdomes horas, mesuses, or plerotheses, tes hebdomes horas, which is as that seventh hour zone was beginning, as it was middling, or as it was ending. And so
Mm,
when they needed to make an appointment or give more specific information, that's how they did it. So they would place you at the beginning, the middle, or the end of one of those intervals, but you're never on one of the lines between the intervals. Whereas in our way of telling time, we make everything refer to one of those lines between the intervals.
right. Or if we want to do otherwise, we'll give between 1 and 1:30.
Right. And again,
We're
but which right.
citing two lines and
Yeah, and so
specifying
the reference
interval.
point is those two lines. Again, we
Right.
only can think in terms of those lines, and we can tell you, okay, between those two lines. But still, the basis of our thought is those borderlines. The ancient Greeks did not conceive of those borderlines as being moments in time, so they never referred to them. They only ever refer to the intervals between them.
And I mean, I think that makes sense, right? Because when we're dealing with, our culture is very time focused. We
Yeah,
spend time, you lose time. Like time is a very important piece for
yeah,
us.
yeah.
And we're very conscious of that. So, it's the way we think and whatever is all about that. But I'm guessing, you know, there are tons of modern cultures where time isn't money.
I
More it's
think
more
for
more relational. And I'm wondering if, maybe in ancient Greek culture there was less. It wasn't
well,
like
listen.
so much of important if you got there at exactly this thing. Because like, sometime in that hour's fine. We're happy to.
Okay, and in some cases that was definitely true. But on the other hand, they were not impractical people.
Mhm.
And so, for example, if you wanted to set an appointment with your lawyer or something, they weren't going to be stupid enough to say, yeah, let's meet within the seventh hour, because that's too big a window.
Right.
And so they would say, generally, let's meet at the beginning of this hour.
Okay. So is that so then if they're making that specific appointment, are they required to, say archomenos or,
Yeah,
use
exactly. Okay. And so there's not too many of these instances where you see the arjomenes tesporas, but what you do find very often is this funny phrase. It's the most common one, and it's peri ten enaten horan, or peri ten defteran horan. And that is the one that once I understood how they were telling the time, that phrase suddenly did not fit into the scheme along with all the other ones. And it's actually the most common one. And so that has always been translated as around the whatever hour. But of course, it makes no sense to say around the hour-long interval. Like it makes no sense to say, let's meet around the seventh hour-long interval of the day, right? Because if you want to meet at the end of the sixth, you would say that's in the sixth. If you want to meet in the eighth, you would say let's meet in the eighth. You wouldn't say let's meet around the seventh hour-long interval of the day. And yet this is the most common phrase. And I said to myself, hey, this peri in this phrase cannot mean around or about, even if everybody has always translated it as around or about. I said, now that I know how Greeks told the time, in this phrase, it cannot possibly mean around. That was just something that I had realized. And yet, that like the most famous instance of this phrase is the hour of Christ's death, peri Peri enate horan. That's in the Gospel of Matthew, and that has always been translated as around 3 o'clock, which would make perfect sense if the Greeks were telling the time like the Romans, where they were always talking about the line. So you would go to the ninth line on your sundial and you would say, okay, around this ninth line. And that's
So
what
plus
gives,
minus some period of, for,
right,
to say plus minus X number of minutes on
which,
that line.
and everybody has accepted that for 1700 years. And I had realized that petty cannot mean around in that phrase. And yet there's me looking at every single translation of the New Testament that's ever been done, and every single translator has treated that as about or around. And I was like, this is impossible. I cannot be the only person in history who understands this phrase the right way.
Hmm.
And I won't spoil it now, but then just by complete and total accident, I found that the next day I found an ancient Greek writer who, or a theologist who explains what Matthew's phrase means, and he very, very explicitly tells what it means, and it does not mean around the ninth hour.
Okay, so I
So
so that's really interesting. I think this is where we pause this discussion and make a plug because you have an upcoming interview with Luke
yeah,
Ranieri about this.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
I've read your paper, which hopefully will be published at some point soon.
yeah,
Um, and you've got a ton of detail, a lot of original sources cited, including a lot of this contextual, stuff and pictures of that sundial, which is how I knew to ask these questions. Um,
yeah.
so you and Luke
Yeah, and
are going to deep dive this idea, right?
yeah, and going back to where we were, this was the kind of thing that where you, if you don't use the language actively, you will never pose the same questions.
Right.
And you're never going to be forced to think critically in the same way as if you're just doing it all passively. And this is one thing where it turns out that, yeah, again, as absurd as this must sound, all the times in our ancient Greek texts have been mistranslated, treated as if it were the Romans giving this time, whereas the Greeks, again, they had a different system, a different conception of how the day was divided. And so because because I was being forced to use this language actively, I discovered this. And so that's, something that I think it's interesting,
Okay.
and it's just not just about the times in the Bible, but in all the ancient Greek texts that we have, all the hours have been translated wrong. So we'll maybe talk about that another time.
Yeah. I want to, like I said, I know Luke's going to do a really good job with this interview on the time thing, and I think it'll be video too, so I'm sure he'll be able to put the
Yeah,
images up and stuff. So
yeah,
that'll be a lot more helpful for people than what I do with just the audio podcast. So I
yeah,
say
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
let's
you
wait.
definitely need to see. Yeah, they definitely, and that was the turning point for me is when I saw
Yeah.
an actual, and I don't know how many people have actually seen an ancient Greek sundial with the hours labeled on it. Have you seen one, or
Okay.
had you seen one
Other than the
before?
pictures in your and you have that picture is in your the
Yeah, it's in the
lexicon as well,
lexicon. Yeah, so
and,
this information is in the lexicon.
in a
So
summarized form or more
yeah, in a
condensed
summarized
form.
form, without the very extensive evidence which is out there for this, but anybody who has the lexicon will be able to correctly understand numbered hours when they find them in an ancient Greek text and use those phrases themselves. And so it's not that much of a secret. We won't give a spoiler. We'll let people look this up in the lexicon.
Yeah, it sounds good. So again, like I usually do at the end of episodes, Adrian, how can if people want to follow your work and what you're up to, where can they find you?
For now, nothing. They can just get the lexicon. Like I said, later on this year, I'm going to start publishing a series of, I guess, intermediate readers, but where it's going to be fun text in Koine that maybe are not so familiar to people, but will be good fun. And we're going to have the Greek text on one page, and on the opposite page, is going to be the explanations of what the tricky vocabulary words mean, or if the syntax of the sentence is a
Mm.
little more complicated, we'll give a simplified version of it so that um, so I'm going to be hopefully coming out with the ghost stories before Halloween. After that, we'll do the Seven Wonders of the World.
Oh, nice.
There's some more good fun stuff out there. And when I start those, I will also probably start. I might do it on Jenny's YouTube channel, or I might start my own where I'm gonna read, little excerpts from those texts and talk about those texts, but in a really friendly way. And that's something that where I hope to use my experience teaching modern languages to help people with the ancient Greek. So there will be kind of pre-learning before we jump into the text, and so we'll talk about the new vocabulary that's coming up, any tricky bits of that author's style we'll talk about, and then we'll read excerpts from the text, but hopefully after having prepared well enough for it that it'll really make sense to everybody.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to that, and we'll have to have you back at some point in the future to talk about what you're up to and
Yeah, that would be
project.
great. And obviously I'll keep you updated about that. It'll be hopefully that'll be happening before the end of 2024, if not early in 2025. And I guess these texts they've waited like 2000 years already. So probably a month here or there isn't going to make a big difference.
Yeah.
But that's what and so at that point, I'll have a YouTube channel, and whether I need to set up my own web page or whatever, we'll see. I hope not. I hope I've had um, a great time working together with Jenny Teichman up to this point, and her website Argos Didaski, or
Yeah.
Ancient Greek with Argos, is one I can recommend. She's got great stuff on there, and so the books might be plugged on there. So that's a good for now. That's a good place to check, and then we'll see what I come up with on my own later this year.
Well, great. Thank you. We'll check back with you in a couple of months or next year or something, see how things are going.
Thank you so much, Fletcher. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and we'll be in touch.
All right, great.
And to everybody else out there, hey, I hope you're making progress, and be brave. Ancient Greek is tough, but it's worth it. And I hope that my lexicon has made it a little bit easier for you.
Well, great. Thanks.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under Creative Commons 3.0 Attribution License. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.